Hey everyone, we will be starting in just a few minutes. So it looks like people are just now arriving because we just turned on, we just went live. So people are still joining. If you guys can hear me, go ahead and just say hi in the chat. Okay, it looks like there are people here. So if you guys could, Margaret, you can hear me, right?
I can hear you.
Okay. Like, it looks like 15 people have joined. So now I'm just getting concerned. Since nobody is saying that they can hear us. It does say that we're going live though.
Oh, that's so strange.
Yeah, it is. It's been a couple months since I've done one of these. I've not had this happen before. Okay. Somebody was finally brave enough to say I hear you. Thank you. All right, cool. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Today we are going to be talking about targeted grazing, also known as goat landscaping, all that kind of cool stuff. And we are joined by Margaret Chamas, who has been doing this for 7 years and also helping other goat owners do this as well. So welcome, Margaret.
Thanks for having me back, Deborah.
Margaret is...
All right, so...
Go ahead. I was just going to say that you can't be on camera because you're in the middle of a big storm and you've got some technical difficulties.
Yeah, so we're here, and that's about the best that I'm doing today. And so kind of with that, because my visibility is limited, as folks have questions, feel free to pop them into the chat, and Deborah will make sure I get any that are immediately pertinent for clarification on the particular slide, and I should have time at the end to answer all the rest of them. So please do ask questions. And I want to be clear, while this cover slide especially is very goats on the go centric, that being the affiliateship I've been working with and now also work for part-time, this is not a goats on the go sales pitch. I'm going to be talking about goat grazing in general. This is just the frame of reference I come at it from and how I'm most familiar with it. So it's more about this is how I got my credentials, so to speak, not me like trying to convince everyone else this is the only way to go. And that is my basic contact info. That is my direct cell number. So I am happy to take calls, take emails, answer questions now or anytime in the future. So this presentation is titled Targeted Grazing, Outreach, Conservation, and Profit with Goats. We do all of the above. With targeted grazing, it's a strange industry. It's a neat industry. It's not for everyone, but for the people who really get into it and enjoy it, it is tremendous amounts of fun and rewarding, both kind of personally, on a personal and emotional satisfaction level, and then financially. So if you have watched the news ever recently, especially during the spring and summer and even into the fall, you see things like this. You see goats being used more often to manage vegetation in areas where it isn't wanted. And it gets a lot of press, which I think is great because there is so little positive press out these days. But because people have also finally figured out how cool goats are and how much they can do for us on kind of the environmental level. So how did this come about? Over the past, I'd say 10 years or so. Now, goat grazing is much older than that, obviously, but we've really seen the change in this last decade. We see more frequent wildfires, more severe wildfires in certain parts of the country. In other parts of the country, we're having continued extreme challenges with noxious and invasive weeds. There's been a growth in regenerative agriculture and an interest in supporting it financially. And there's also been an interest in larger corporations becoming environmentally responsible, whatever they define that is. And also at the same time, like I said, we need some positive press. So people are looking for things that are fun and engaging and happy. And groups or corporations or organizations or municipalities are looking to support those sorts of things, those sorts of positive things. And on top of this, goats became, somewhere along the line, they became social media darlings. The rest of the world finally figured out how amazing and funny they are. And so you put this all together, and we have this perfect storm of people being interested in the very sorts of things that goats offer. At the same time, we have some population shifts. We have people moving from city centers to suburbia. And this has been accentuated post-COVID, but it's been going on a lot longer than that. We also have a lot of better technology in electric fencing, solar fence chargers, ability to keep animals contained reliably with less permanent infrastructure. There's been a bit of research on targeted grazing and the effects that sheep or goats or other ruminants can have on undesirable vegetation. And the gig economy has taken a bigger stand. People are looking for side things to make themselves a bit more money, and also things that they feel good about doing to make more money. There's also, this growing agritourism, ag education, and I know that's going to be a focus of some later talks this week. COVID, as I said, COVID has accentuated all of the above things. COVID 2020 was actually like my best year, sad to say, or odd to say. But that just accentuated all the different things. People started thinking more about our health. People tried to be outside more, or they could only do things outside more. And people also started fleeing cities at a faster rate, after which they realized, gosh, there's a bunch of unwanted vegetation. So you put all these things together, and we have this new business of targeted grazing becoming both very popular with customers and very accessible to people looking to get into it. Okay, so when I talk about targeted grazing, what do I mean? It is the use of grazing animals as a tool to control problematic vegetation. The most typical example of this you will see or hear about is goats consuming brushy, weedy, invasive, or nuisance vegetation. But it also controls, yes.
I just realized you haven't advanced your slides.
I am on my end. Is it not on your end?
No. Okay, now we got some.
Okay, so right now I'm showing photos of screenshots of news posts. Are you seeing that?
Yep, that's what I'm seeing now.
Okay. And then another slide. How did we get here?
Nope.
Oh, this is very strange.
We're still looking at the University of Richmond. How did we get here? Got it.
Okay, so if I go to actually present, it seems to not adjust with you guys. Oh, that's so silly.
It doesn't look like you're on present on our end because we're still seeing your whole PowerPoint thing with the stuff over here. So it wasn't coming out in presentation mode.
Right. As soon as I click on starting the slideshow, that's when it seems to stop updating on your end.
When you're switching to slideshow, it doesn't realize you're sharing the new window because it creates a new window when you do that.
I guess I can do it from this screen because it doesn't let me, because I don't have a second screen. I don't think I can have it in present mode and share it at the same time.
Okay.
So I will make this, that still looks big enough to be readable, correct?
I can read it, but I have a really big screen. So, but probably Yeah.
I'm going to try one more time. Sorry, guys. I don't know why this is being such a problem. Let me see if... It says keep slides updated. All right, now it's on how did we get here, and I'm going to advance to targeted grazing basics. Did it update to targeted grazing basics for you?
No, we're still seeing how did we get here.
Yep, so it seems that I just can't.
Okay, we got targeted.
Well, that's because I backed, but that's because I backed out of the presenter mode. Okay, our power is currently back on, so I can try and get onto 2 screens, and maybe that'll let us work.
Okay.
While we adjust, are there any questions so far with the first 3 slides I've done?
Nope, not yet. So.
Did you turn that off?
No, it's on.
It doesn't think it is.
If anyone just joined us, we're having technical difficulties, which we will have straightened out in just a moment.
Unplug something?
Mm-hmm. Oh, turn it back on.
So that's interesting. Carla said
I didn't turn this off.
that if you click on the link in the email, there's no way to chat. So I think some people went to YouTube and they can chat there. Are you on YouTube, Carla?
I have my second one up, and now I am going to share the other screen.
Woohoo! You did it.
Oh, good. And now I can actually go back and forth and you all can see it. Okay.
Yeah, you're cruising now.
Oh, everyone, please do a collective fingers crossed that we don't lose power again. It's not storming right now, so hopefully that stays away.
Yeah.
Okay. We were talking about the basics of targeted grazing, and it is using animals as the tool to control vegetation, whether that is goats controlling brush and weeds, or sheep controlling the vegetation under solar panels, or cattle doing cheatgrass management out west, similar things like that. Again, animals are the tool. You'll also see this called biological control or prescription grazing, and those are important terms because the Natural Resources Conservation Service and other conservation-minded funders will occasionally offer cost share incentive payments for goat grazing, but those are the words they like to use. And then colloquially, it's called goatscaping or landscaping, and then you'll hear goat rental as an easy but somewhat inaccurate phrase people use. And again, I think I've said this 2 or 3 times, but I will keep saying it throughout the day. Vegetation management is the primary goal, not animal production. Animals are just the tools we use to do the vegetation management. So this works by taking the right species of animals, letting them graze at the right time with the right intensity and the right frequency of grazing to meet the needs of the landscape or the vegetation. This could be stunting or suppressing early season growth. So that's a common one I do for prairie management. We're struggling against invasive cool season grasses that will choke out prairie plantings or against some of the brush species. And so we go graze those hard and fast early in the season. In general, we're removing the photosynthetic capacity of these different types of, plants that we don't want to let something else grow in its place. So maybe we're waiting a bit to graze the, brush canopy at a time where we know we can then plant something else that will sprout up immediately and fill that niche in the environment. At other times of year, especially during the winter or the early spring, we'll have the animals out there to strip the bark off and disrupt nutrient flow, hit some of those brush species a bit harder. And in general, sometimes we're just breaking the reproductive cycle of these plants, trying to hit them just before or at their seed set so that they don't spread seeds and go another generation. So it is highly technical in the sense that you need to know what species you're controlling and how to best manage them. For landowners, this is an attractive management option because it screams, I'm eco-friendly, I'm responsible, and it's a good PR image. It also outsources a task that is hard to get people to do because the alternatives might include guys out there with chainsaws or weed eaters, and that's not something that there's a ton of interest in. Those labor resources can be used somewhere else. This is a common sentiment for, say, parks managers. And again, depending on the landscape, depending on what exactly you're looking to control, this can be very cost competitive with some of the other options. I made a highly unscientific chart trying to compare what I see customers kind of going between. The main control methods we look at are on the top: grazing, machinery or mechanical, herbicide, and then manual clearing of vegetation. And then some of the different things that certain customers are concerned about. So the cost versus how long does the impact actually last versus, how much labor does it require? Grazing is kind of middle of the road for a lot of these. Can be more expensive on the cost side, but there's times when it's just the only applicable option. Other times, while herbicide tends to be a bit cheaper, it also tends to be a bit less targeted or specific because you're going and blanket spraying a lot of things in many of these cases. And there's obviously, the literal downstream effects of any of that getting into the environment. So these are some of the things that our customers are considering whether or not they actually realize it. Okay, so the farmers who are getting into targeted grazing, it's an intriguing enterprise and it's really attractive because it is very profitable and it cash flows nicely. You're getting a check every time you finish a job, and that might be every week or two. Compare that to most animal agriculture where you get a check when the animal goes off to processing or goes off to the auction. Depending on your situation, if you already have goats and have a truck and a trailer, you've got the most expensive things that are required to get into this. So the startup can be a bit low. If you don't have the truck, the trailer, the goats, there's still other avenues that you can get into or ways to access this. So we have people who lease goats from other farmers rather than own their own, lease trailers, lease equipment. So you don't need to have all the things in order to do this. For those who have a home base and perhaps have a goat enterprise that they're looking to make more money off of, now you can boot some of your animals off your property, send them somewhere, have them make money. And meanwhile, you still have all your pastures at home that can be raising, raising this year's kids or being cut for hay or being stockpiled for fall feed. There's a lot of different options and it gives you a bit more flexibility, especially if you have limited acreage at home. And it allows some animals to earn keep before or after their reproductive life cycle. So most commonly, a lot of people I know are grazing their yearlings. And so these are animals who haven't yet had their own offspring, or they're still gaining weight to go to market. They aren't making money. They're costing money, in fact. And so this is a way for them to step up how quickly they repay for their birth and upkeep. And it is scalable. It doesn't take a lot of goats to get this going. And over time, you can have either bigger herds or more herds of smaller groups of goats. So it is a really cool opportunity. I also suspect this might be one of the coolest kind of sustainable things out there. So if you look at the three-legged stool of sustainability, there's the environment, the economy, and then the social side. And this hits a bit of everything. Obviously, this is very beneficial to the environment, both getting rid of the quote unquote bad plants and supporting healthy animals, healthy soils. It's great for the economy because it is keeping money into small farms, into small rural economies. And frankly, I think it's good for society because people learn about the ecosystem, learn about the effects of their actions, and it just brings people together. It builds a lot of community. People enjoy this process. So is this a good fit for you and your animals? You will probably need some new skills. So I started this out 7 years ago. I knew goats, I knew grazing, I didn't know the business side of it. And I knew plants as a general thing, and I knew grazing as a very general concept, but I didn't know specifically grazing to target certain species, or how far do I have to let them graze to get the effects I want, but also how do I manage the animals to make sure that we're also not dealing with parasite issues. So I did have to pick up some new skills, even though I had what you would think of as some of the basics. Also had to learn a lot of project management and customer service to be able to answer everyone's questions, keep a straight face when either being asked the silliest question for the 10,000th time or just dealing with unreasonable customers. And the business management side was new to me. So it does take new skills, and it takes a lot of skills. And that may not be everybody's strength. I talk to a lot of folks who think it's a really cool concept, but they straight up say that's too much dealing with people. I don't want to deal with the public. I don't want to deal with non-farm people that much. And that's legit. That is totally fair. There are also risks to the animals. These are minor. Most of the real risks are minor and generally non-fatal, but it is important to mention them. It's rare for animals to have issues with toxic plants, especially if they've been grazing for most of their life, but it can happen. The more threatening thing is, frankly, exposure to the public and the public's dogs. People always ask me if I'm worried about coyotes or bobcats or mountain lions, and frankly, I'm not. I'm worried about two-legged predators and loose dogs. That's what causes the most damage to my animals. And these animals are on a very goat-appropriate diet because it is the brush and the weeds and the variety that they are, evolutionarily designed to eat, but it varies from project to project. They might be on a monoculture of bush honeysuckle and then move to a monoculture of, garlic mustard or something. And so we do have to monitor them and be mindful of what are they eating, and do we need to step in at any point and kind of mitigate that by giving them some sort of supplementation. And one of the challenges, the busy season for grazing is the busy season for pretty much everything else. It is often whatever your growing season is. So it's the same time of year that you might be doing chickens and, running cattle through pastures or milking or and many other sorts of farm activities. I also want to point out that there's a couple of differences compared to, just raising goats in a production setting, whether that production setting is, feedlot or pasture-based or whatever. Once again, the animals are the tool we're using, and our primary goal is managing the vegetation to the customer and the landscape's needs. This means that takes a slight precedence over the animal's ideal well-being. Now, we're not going to let them lose, 3 points of body condition. We're not going to allow them to eat down to where they only have toxic plants left to select from. But it means that we might hit some of those projects and they slip condition by a half a point to a point. It might mean that, our biggest focus is animals that can get the job done, not necessarily the prettiest looking animals, although you do also have to have, clean, healthy animals. Otherwise, the public gets very upset. This also changes the sorts of animals that work best for this, because managing the land and not optimum care of livestock or optimum nutrition of livestock is our goal. Frankly, I wouldn't recommend putting your prize replacement females on this job because they might get into monocultures of something that just doesn't have as much protein as they might need, or they might be in an area that has rattlesnakes or stray dogs. So it's one of those, we don't put, I wouldn't want to call the animals disposable, but put animals out that you realize and are okay with accepting that there's a risk that something bad will happen to them. Because it's not always, tragic, like lost by rattlesnake. It's also things like broken legs because they got a leg hooked in a tree, or they, tore an ear up because they got into some brambles or something. So it's just aesthetically and performance-wise, these animals are not always going to be gaining the fastest. It's probably just the most cost, or it pays the best. The focus is on the economics. We have to make sure that the animals are grazing fast enough for us to pay ourselves to continue paying for the animals' upkeep. And again, not necessarily to have animals at a body condition score of, 4 or 5, looking fat and sassy. Really, though, the biggest challenge for incoming goat grazers or targeted grazers is we are providing a service, not getting paid to feed our goats. This goes back to what I've been saying about the goats are the tool we're using to do this landscape management. This also starts to be how we talk to customers, because I bet a bunch of people listening to this have had someone inquire with them, oh, you could send your goats over to my yard or my property and let them graze. That's fine. Do that. Make use of that feed resource that's being made available to you. But remember that if you're managing it to their expectations, then you are providing a service. You're not getting a perk. And so one of the things I have to emphasize both to new goat grazers and to a lot of customers is, if you want us to correct the problem that you've created by not managing the land you're on, this is a service. I deserve to get paid for doing this service. If you just want me to feed my goats, then I'm going to manage it the way I want. That works best for me and is most efficient. And that means it's going to get done when I want it to get done, not when you need it to get done for management of this vegetation. It means I'm going to graze only the best stuff and then move on. I'm not going to clean up everything so that you get the clear landscape you're expecting. So this is a service and we deserve to get paid for it. Okay, next most common questions. What does this cost to get into? This also includes some of the things you need to get started. On the more physical attributes or asset side, you need a truck, you need a trailer. We need a way to get these animals from place to place. Many people come into this with trucks, and I'm always relieved when I hear that when people are talking to me about it, because this is not the time to have to buy a new truck. You need electric netting or some sort of fence or containment system. You need fence chargers. You need water tanks and hose. Those miscellaneous things, I've priced that out at about $2,500 to get started. I'm not even going to try and ballpark estimate what a truck or a trailer would cost, because I've learned that is so incredibly regional. And to an extent, it's going to depend on how big you want to get, how fast. Do you think you're going to do, 30 goats? That's going to be a different sort of investment than if you think you're going to do 50 or 60 or 100 goats in terms of the truck and trailer. Insurance. Everyone wants to know what insurance costs. Frankly, I would as well. We do have commercial liability insurance. This is a goats on the go thing in particular, and I'd recommend it for anybody. This covers your butt if the goats get out and eat someone's prize begonias, if they get out and get on the road, if someone comes and screws with your stuff. This is keeping you safe. But the cost is excruciatingly variable and hard to predict. I've heard everything from a couple $100s to a couple $1,000. That said, the $1,000 or more is usually California, frankly. And then in some cases, it's people who are also insuring the animals themselves, as well as like the business entity. And then a startup cost or a startup requirement are the goats. Are you going to own these goats? That's one way of getting into it. If you already have goats, then that's a low startup cost. If you already have them, you can also rent them. Like I mentioned, we have people who only own, maybe a 5 goats of their own and maybe a half an acre or 2 acres of land. They lease from other farms and just send them back at the end of the grazing season. You don't get to sell any market animals and get an extra cash bump at the end of the year, but you don't have to worry about feeding anybody over the winter. It's actually a pretty slick deal. And some people buy new goats at the beginning of the year, keep them all summer, hope to put a bit of weight on them. Maybe if it's does, they get them bred, and then you can sell them as, fence trained, experienced, solid brood does to go to somebody else. So again, a couple of different options for getting into this, each with their different price points. What sort of profit potential is here? I broke this out into a few different scales, especially further west. Let's say west of, central Kansas, maybe, at least is my best reference point. So by the time you get to Colorado and points west, many companies are operating with what I consider to be really large scale herds. They are working with hundreds of goats. They transport them often with semis. They usually have a shepherd on site all the time, and they measure in how many acres are we going to clear per day. These companies often also have a minimum acreage that they'll graze. So they won't touch projects that are less than, I've heard everything from 15 to 25 acres.
No.
And those sorts of projects, the numbers I've heard are somewhere, $300 to $700 per acre for that sort of work. Which, if you're doing if you're doing multiple acres per day, that adds up very quickly. On the other hand, so does having a full-time shepherd. That's quite a big cost. The mid-sized jobs, and this is what I'm most familiar with, this is what I've done the most work in. We're talking 1 to 10 acres, perhaps. We measure our herds in the dozens of goats. We can transport them ourselves, often on a bumper pole or a moderate-sized gooseneck trailer. And we measure in how many days does it take to clear 1 acre, rather than how many acres do we clear in a day. And prices for this, I've heard everywhere. These days, it's pretty much in the 4 figures, but the range overall, I'd say between 800 and 2,000 per acre. I'd say the most common range is probably 1,000 to 1,500 per acre. And then there is a subset of extra small jobs that seem to be very polarizing. I love small jobs. I have friends who hate small jobs and give me their small jobs because they just don't even want to bother with it. So these are things I consider small to be less than an acre. So this might be someone's backyard, or they have a half acre that they want to get cleaned up a little bit. These sometimes come pre-fenced, which can be pretty cool, but you have to make sure you can actually trust that fence with goats in it. And these are often much more expensive on a per acre basis, but you may not be grazing a whole acre, so it may not, the fee you actually get might not be $1,500 for that, half or quarter or tenth of an acre. In many cases, this is where it might be more common to charge by the day instead of by the acre. And I didn't put anything about the herd size in this case. I've done this sort of stuff with the dozens of goats herds. I have some friends who will have, one friend of mine called it her party herd. It was like 6 goats that she would bring for these sorts of, kind of specialty gigs.
Margaret?
Yes.
We're hearing background noise. Somebody talking, I think.
Yep, hang on one second.
Okay.
Okay, that should be minimized. Lost my spot. Something else that affects profit potential is the grazing season. So I'm grossly oversimplifying this, but here's what I got. So if you are working with nuisance vegetation management, which most often is what I'm dealing with here in the central and upper Midwest, this is more common in the Northeast and the Southeast, and then I think, or I know, some in the Pacific Northwest, but basically the not dry areas, the places that aren't dealing with wildfires, we're dealing with nuisance vegetation control. And so our grazing season is pretty much our growing season. If things are green and actively growing, we probably have work. Once that stops, we stop working. There's a limited ability for off-season grazing in some areas with some certain species, but it's not super common. And then where things are going for fire mitigation, so mostly the west and southwestern US, the grazing season, some people are telling me that it's really just the wet season. So again, the growing season, but that might not coincide with the warm season as a lot of us think about it. I am less familiar with this work, admittedly, but you're limited by when some of these species are palatable. Folks have been telling me that the goats will only eat certain types of grasses until a certain stage of development, and then they have to quit. They have to pull them off. So knowing the palatability of your region's plants is pretty important, along with also being able to identify it, knowing the reproductive cycle. Snapshot here of a goats on the go style business. This is just how most of us operate. It is not our a rule that we've put into place, but this is just what most of our folks end up running. We are in that mid-sized business where we're doing, up to 10 acres. Most of our jobs, I'd say, are between 1 and 3 acres. Most affiliates have herds. They might have one herd, they might have multiple herds, but our basic grazing unit is 3 to 5 dozen goats, whatever will fit on your trailer. And we found that 20 goats is the minimum you really need to be cash flow effective. We graze about an acre per week. Obviously, there's a tremendous amount of variation in that, but that's kind of our internal target or ballpark or measuring stick. And most of us are using meat breeds of goats because selling market animals at the end of the season is an extra cash flow. We also have found that a lot of our meat breeds, especially when you get into, Kiko, Spanish Savannah, they've been less selected to rely on human inputs to survive. So they're still more attuned naturally to go search out their own vegetation, to be a bit more vigilant and watch and stay wary of predators. They need a little bit less coddling to grow and to get by on vegetation only. And frankly, any gender works just fine. I graze males, females, hermaphrodites, don't care. And for most of us, the grazing season, again, is our growing season. Digging in a bit to the species I hear about doing late winter or early spring. If you are in Minnesota or Wisconsin, you have buckthorn. And buckthorn is a horribly annoying invasive that's getting a lot of attention and control attempts. Goats will start to strip the bark off over the winter. And because it's dry and cold up there, as opposed to where I'm at, where it's wet and cold, where it's dry and cold, you can have them out and about during the winter much more easily without worrying about, respiratory issues. So some people will do grazing projects over the winter because they can get some kind of low and slow control by bark stripping. In other areas, things like winter creeper, English ivy, some of those species with those kind of waxy leaves are not terribly palatable, and the goats will ignore them during a lot of the growing season when there's better options. But you get to the early spring or late winter and there's really not much else out there, they will happily go mow those down. So we adjust a lot. At the bottom is a snapshot or a screenshot of my planning calendar from a couple of years ago. And you can see I've got different, I don't know if you can see my cursor. I've got different project names that I was on. I had 3 different herds running at this point. This one herd up top that was doing a huge job, for me at least. It was, that year it would have been, I think, around 30 acres. A moderate sized job here that took a bit longer than I thought, but that kept that herd plenty busy. And then I had a smaller herd at the bottom that was doing all these like teeny tiny little backyard type jobs. All right. So another question I frequently get, what does this take time-wise? Can I do this and have other things going on? And the answer is generally yes. So for the grazing jobs itself, every day, check on the goats. I mean, this kind of makes sense. Make sure the fence is still intact, make sure the goats are all standing the right way up, make sure the water tank is full, get a sense of they've got enough vegetation for another day and then I'm going to have to build fence, that sort of things. This will often take half an hour plus your drive time. 2, maybe 3 times a week, the goats have finished grazing everything in their current area. And so now you need to build a new paddock fence and move them on to the next area on the same project. Estimate that takes an hour and a half to 2 hours and then your drive time. And then a couple times a month, depending on the size of projects you're doing, you've got to load the goats up and move them to a new project. So pull out the trailer, get it to the site, load the goats up, tear the existing fence down, drive to the new spot, set up the new fence, put the goats in, fill the water tanks, make sure they're good, go home. This can take, this is a more significant endeavor. And then an unknown number of times per day, month, year, it's not a matter of if, it is a matter of when, you'll get the call that the goats are out. And you have to respond to that immediately and go deal with the situation. So there are many days when the goats are really only requiring half an hour plus drive time. But there are days where they're going to take a couple of hours of your time. And then you do still need to be on call no matter what. So yes, it is very possible to do this on top of other things. Maybe that's more farm enterprises. Maybe that's a part-time or a full-time job. It depends on how much extra help you have around, if it's you and a partner or you and kids. But make sure it does require some flexibility because you can't always guarantee that the goats move to new projects on a weekend. There are ways to kind of shift that around. Okay, it's Thursday and they're almost finished with the current project. We're going to bring them a few bales of hay to tide them over to the weekend. But it does often require a little bit of flexibility in whatever other things you are doing. And then there's time that needs to be taken for the business management. I estimate I spend, 30 to 60 minutes a day responding to new inquiries, just sending people basic information, scheduling jobs, working on my existing schedule to see where I'm going to fit customers, communicating with existing customers. Hey, we're about a job away from you. I think it's going to be 7 more days. And then writing the bid, sending the quotes, doing the mapping, sending the invoices. So the business management is super important. Timely responsiveness to customers is super important. And so that does need to bake into your time expectations. And then actually doing those site visits. You'll probably end up doing a few of those a week during the grazing or growing season. And those often take an hour plus whatever the drive time is. So this is something that each of these components isn't a lot of time, but it can accumulate and kind of surprise you if you aren't allocating for it. Long story short, my first year I did goat grazing. I did it on top of a full-time job. It was hard, but not impossible. My second year of goat grazing, I had 2 herds of goats out grazing, and I had a full-time job, and I had goats I was milking at home and chickens and things like that. And partway through the grazing season, my husband said, this is not happening again, because he was doing milking for me a lot of times. He said, at the end of this year, something is leaving. It's either the grazing goats, the dairy goats, or the full-time job. And I left the full-time job. And I don't regret that one little bit, but it took a lot of time. So where do we go from here? There are innovations still happening in this space. One of the biggest and coolest ones is virtual fence technology. So these are some of my goats with their no fence collars on. And then on the right is one of the maps of my pastures at home. You can see the little dots where the goats are now. You can see the heat map of where they were over the past several hours. This isn't a complete game changer. This is changing the game, but it's not turning it into a completely new game, to really mangle a sports metaphor. The virtual fencing allows us a lot of, number one, peace of mind, because we always know where the goats are. It allows us to bypass perhaps some of the most frustrating parts of running fence through thick brush and weeds. If we can just do the perimeter instead of doing every single subdivision, that will save a lot of time, labor, and frustration. It is not a complete replacement for good old electric netting, though, because the GPS technology is not precise enough to give us the level of control that we often find we need with targeted grazing. And because it's not a physical barrier, and because that GPS line wiggles around a little bit, you don't get the goats don't have that same level of, I can graze up to this point and then I'm done. So you don't see the same level of clean grazing is what I've observed and what I hear talking to other folks. Still, this is something we are tremendously excited about, and more people are getting into and using as a complement to their existing fence infrastructure. Remote monitoring, it's nothing new to have, say, like game cameras out and use them as part of your, site security protocols. But there's now some more technology that will remotely sense, like, what's your fence charge at? So you can tell, okay, something happened because all of a sudden the fence charge dropped to near zero. I better go out and check it. We have a few people trying to figure out how to set up like sensors for water tank levels. A lot of the time and a lot of the cost that eats into our profit is just doing those basic daily checks on goats. And so if we had a way to say, hey, we know the goats are in, maybe because they're wearing virtual fence collars, we know they have water because of our, techie water tank, and we know the fence is hot, bet you we can skip going out today. And even just having 1 or 2 days where you don't have to make that drive and walk around the fence and check the goats, that gives a lot of rest and a lot of extra time back, even though it doesn't necessarily seem like it. And then as an industry, where are we going? I'm starting to see, as I talk to more and more affiliates, and as more of our affiliates have been in this longer, I'm starting to see differentiation and specialization. So we now have people who are maybe the overall business owner, but you have one person who's doing the site visits and writing the bids, and then someone else who's actually managing the goats day to day. So there's becoming some of that specialization, similar to you see in many industries. And I think that's a good thing overall, because one of the problems with this work is that it does wear on you. If you are the only person doing it, you're doing the daily labor, you're also doing the business stuff, you're also hauling the goats all over, it can be a burnout. And so being able to shift some of that onto someone else is really great. And again, because people are looking to lease goats instead of always own them, people who are setting up and providing trained herds of goats, maybe some assistance on big fence build days, that is kind of its own side enterprise that's branching off of this industry. Still though, the future is wide open and really uncertain, because this is new as an industry. Again, the goat grazing is not new. People have been doing this for, hundreds of years. But doing it as a business is still relatively new and is still trying to figure out what all the normals are. I listed prices from what I have heard, but I really don't know that, I don't have a good sense of how representative that is. That's just the numbers I've heard. There's no industry norms or standards. It's hard to get insurance on this. You're still talking to people who have no idea what you do. And you talk to municipalities who say, well, that's like a petting zoo. You can't have a petting zoo for 5 days in someone's backyard. So it's still something we're figuring things out as we go, but it's really exciting if you're okay with some of that uncertainty and enjoy being in something a bit new and innovative. One of the coolest things though about this job is the part where most of our customers are really excited to give us money. And I don't say that just because it's a great way to make money. What's exciting about that to me is the fact that I don't have to be a real pushy salesperson. There are people I have to explain, yes, this will cost you money. This is not me getting to feed my goats for free. That is a common discussion you'll have. But for the most part, people are excited to call us up and have us out and bring the goats. They are excited to see us. It's not like a lot of service industries where people call you when something breaks or goes wrong. And that to me is a big positive. With that, I will take questions. And I actually have internet now, so I might even try and come on camera. Yeah, let's go from there.
Awesome.
Oh, yay, it worked.
Awesome.
As long as the lights don't go out.
There are a couple of questions in the chat that I will go ahead and ask you. And if anybody else has questions, feel free to type those in the chat and we will get to them. So Jill was saying that she couldn't find insurance when they looked into it. And you did say it was a little challenging. What did you do to finally find insurance? Or do you have any tips for people on finding that?
It is a lot of calling around. I will say that more often, okay, so the single one provider that more people than not are finding success with is going to be Farm Bureau, but that's not universal. I mean, literally like one county, it will be okay. The next county, it won't. So that's a great place to start, but I can't guarantee you that. American National is not across the entire country, but across at least parts of the Midwest. And I talked to one of their reps at American Dairy Goat Convention a while ago, and she seemed optimistic that it was something they could cover. It is a lot of calling around. That is often one of the biggest headaches and sticking points when people are just getting started at this.
Awesome. Okay. And then could you talk about the collars a little bit more? Are they to track them, or is it more like the dog collars and the invisible fencing?
Yeah, so what you are looking at on the right half of this screen is I set up this virtual fence boundary in the app. And so when the goats approach this virtual fence boundary, they start to hear a tone. They get an audio tone that's actually an ascending tone. Beep, 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 beep. And if they get to the top of that scale, which means that they've still continued walking forwards towards that line, if they get to the top of that scale, they get an electric shock. You can barely see. There are chains that connect the box unit to this like green plasticky strap that conducts electricity, so it gives them a shock. They learn to associate the tones and the shock very quickly. Actually, I was astounded how quickly they did. And so they learn, when I hear the tone, I turn around and go the other way. And so this is keeping them in this contained area, this designated area, as well as letting me know where they are. So the way it works on the app is it updates about every 15 minutes. So every 15 minutes, if I refresh the app, it will show me where the collars are. But it is constantly real time keeping the goats in. So, in real time, as the goat walks up to that imaginary line, they are getting the tone. They are getting snapped if they're too close to the edge.
I know the thing that made me nervous when I first heard about this is that a physical fence is there as much to protect the goats from somebody attacking them as it is to keep them in where you want them. So what happens if a stray dog or coyote comes running along and comes into this area?
Yep. And yes, the fence manufacturers will tell you this is not a replacement for a good solid perimeter fence. They will also tell you, so this company, the only company in the US that offers sheep and goat collars is No Fence, which is based in Norway. So this is not me endorsing No Fence, but besides the fact, like literally you can't buy other collars. In Norway, they have wolves, and they've found no increased loss due to wolf predation with goats with collars, because they actually are free to, they will just plow through the invisible fence when they're being pursued. They can flee to an area they feel safe and secure and then hide and wait. They're not getting tangled in a fence or, stuck at a perimeter fence that's meant to keep them in. So the takeaway I've had so far, I have not been using these super long. I have not had issues. I've seen my goats, kind of scoot across the pasture really quick once or twice. And I have not heard of other people suffering increased predation, but in high security risk or high safety risk areas, we are still coupling this with electric netting. And in particular on especially public facing grazing projects. Yes, the fence is to keep people on one side and goats on the other. So the physical fence is still very much something I want to be there on targeted grazing projects. It's like I said, you might just be able to enclose the entire perimeter of an area, or just, the side that's most high risk of traffic or interference, and then use the no fence collars to do the subdivisions within that larger area.
Okay. Somebody asked about the battery life on the collar.
It is ever changing and ever improving. So I got my collars last fall, and I put them on my goats in late November or early December. And they're still like 89+% battery life. Those oddball boxes have a solar panel on them. So as much as possible, that's trying to keep the battery recharged. Things that will reduce the battery life, though, is these collars rely on cell networks to communicate. So if you don't have a very good cell network and it's struggling to find service, that will zap the battery life a bit faster. If the goats are in an area where they are interacting with the barrier more often, or interacting with the virtual fence boundary, that will zap the battery more. So when you look at the screenshot there on the right, the goats, when they first got into this area they're kind of hanging out around by is a timber line that's right on the edge of our property. And so the battery life would have been, greatly reduced when they were in there because they were constantly right near that edge, getting signals and shocks. So the more extensively you're grazing them, the more area they have to roam, the less often they're interacting with a boundary, the longer the battery life will last. And then the reverse is true. The more you're keeping them condensed, the more often they're interacting, the quicker they'll zap the batteries.
Okay. And I would imagine every goat needs to have a collar.
Every animal over 6 months of age is recommended to have a collar. I know in Norway, where they have herds who've been using this for years upon years, they're starting to get away with a smaller percentage of the herd being collared. But that's something I expect to come only with generations of goats, like growing up and learning, if I hear this beep, I better turn around. I have heard from some folks that in California, they're really just starting to collar the lead goats. But on those places that are talking about that, they're also in situations where the line that you're drawing that you don't want the goats to cross is actually very broad. It doesn't matter if there's goats, within 50 feet of either side, say, or something like that. So it's okay if the herd is generally staying in this area, but it does not have to have like a hard do not cross this. So I would not do that sort of thing by a highway. Which means that in my situations, every animal is going to have a collar for the foreseeable future.
Okay. And have you had trouble with them getting the collars tangled in horns or brush or anything?
I think I've had 3, maybe 4 collars pop off. And right now it's mostly because they're sitting at home eating on hay bales more than anything else. And so they're getting caught on the panels for the hay feeders. I'm impressed with how when they were out grazing and not in the barnyard. No, I had no losses. It's pretty infrequent. They actually, I put these things on the goats and I'm like, they're goats. They're going to chew all over this. They're going to mess it up. They're going to be hooking it with their horns. I was astounded because within about 15 to 20 minutes of each goat getting its collar on, they ignored it until it started zapping them. Then they weren't sure about it again. I was really astounded with how quickly they adapted. And I put this on goats who, that kind of bluish gray one in the picture, she's, oh man, she'll be 7 or 8 this year. Like even the older goats could learn some new tricks. I was really, really impressed, and it really doesn't seem to bother them at all having it there.
Okay. There's quite a bit of conversation in the chat from people who are concerned about security, both like people stealing them, predators, and then questions about guardian donkey, guard dogs. How do you deal with all of that? What do you think of guard animals and then the whole predator theft issue?
Good questions. I also see someone who asked about price of the collars. Right now, they're about $200 per collar. Then there's like a $50-ish annual service fee for the app service, and then you'll need some number of spare batteries. So yeah, $200 per collar, but add in that service cost and then budget a bit for some spare collars or spare batteries. Yes. So site security. Yes. I have had fence chargers stolen, fence cut, fence knocked over. Other folks have had goats stolen. It is a risk. To a great extent, my site security is being willing to say no to certain sites. Unfortunately, I've had to do that. There are just certain parts of town, certain towns that I won't go near. And that's why it's helpful if you are familiar with the area you're grazing. That said, a lot of our more public-facing jobs, which are in a lot of ways higher risk, are also the ones where you have the most leverage to say to the local cops or the park rangers, like, you got to help me out. We are working on this together. Please do some extra drive-bys. Please have extra security. Put up an extra layer of dead fence, like snow fence or something. So there's a couple of different ways you can improve site security. Have the cameras out. I had one job where the local police did bring out like their big units with like kind of the placards that had like the flashing signs like goats in area, don't touch the fence, and they had cameras on them so they could see most of the main fence line people would have been walking on. And it is not my standard practice to stay overnight with the goats or camp out with them, but that is an option some people pursue just as one extra layer of security. And there are definitely jobs where I would consider doing that. I do tend to spend most of the night with them on July 4th, if I don't remove them from sites altogether, because fireworks are not friends with a lot of goats. Even my goats, who we live a few miles from a shooting range. So pops and bangs are not terrifying. It's the pop and bang that's above their heads and it looks like something's falling at them. That seems to trigger the full-on panic reaction.
Yeah.
Predators and guardians, people asked. Depends on your state, depends on your location. Most of the time, if you have liability insurance, they are not going to want you to have a guard dog on someone else's property with your animals. That is often a no-go. That said, there are some states, there are some areas where the livestock guardian dogs are considered livestock and legislated as such, and so it's allowable. I will say, I find I don't need guardians hardly ever, because the dumb human is, I don't know if the dumb human or the drunk human more often is really going to be dissuaded by a dog. Hopefully they would, but I don't know. A guardian dog is going to be a huge liability for that drunk human. And ultimately I would pay the price. And we don't worry much about natural predators. I've grazed in mountain lion territory. The farmer warned me if I was going to come out because there was one on his trail cams the day before we dropped the goats off. And I said, nope, I'm really not worried, because I'm putting a lot of animals with horns in a relatively small area with electric netting and moving them every few days. That's not something a natural predator looks at and says, oh, I'm going to go eat that. So really our threat is the two-leggers and their dogs. I have used a guardian donkey a few times, and I know a few other folks who use donkeys or llamas because they are less of a liability risk. And they still are, one extra layer of protection, and they eat the same stuff as the goats do. So they can be a bit of they can reduce your stress level a little bit. But yeah, guardian dogs themselves, I'm pretty hesitant about, but I know we do have some folks who use them because in their area, in their type of project, it's acceptable.
What do you use for shade and shelter when they're out on location?
And that's going to vary again by your locale. I rarely do I do anything specific for shade or shelter. The goats will survive, even if it rains, even if it's sunny. For the most part, they're okay. They're often grazing in thick brush, which means they can get under, there's usually trees they can get underneath for some shade or shelter. I will rearrange or cherry pick jobs if we're going into a heat wave. It's going to be triple digits. I'm not going to bring them to the job that has no shade cover or no cross breeze whatsoever. But in general, I expect them to be big kids and just suck it up for a little while. And they will, like you'll go out and it'll be raining and they'll squawk and whine at you. And then they'll go fill their bellies and then go crawl back under a bush for a while. That said, that's my comfort level. That's not everyone's comfort level. And so I have strung up tarps and things like that when I'm on a public park and you need that extra, visible layer of animal care and control. There might be municipalities that have specific guidelines on, all domestic animals must be provided with shade, water, shelter sort of thing. And then you make something happen, a trailer or tarp strung up.
Yeah, I was just thinking, somebody also just mentioned in the chat, what I was thinking is that you would just put your trailer in the middle of the grazing area and put up your electric fence around it and then open the trailer door and let everybody go out and use that as a shelter. Is there a reason that you wouldn't do that?
Number one, I might need my trailer somewhere else because I'm often running multiple herds. Number two, if you leave it in the middle of the area, they are going to chew your wires up. Number three, they're going to hang by that trailer instead of going and grazing as much. So you will end up with a dead loafing spot and not the same level of uniform grazing that you really want. And I will be honest, there's a lot of jobs where I'm dropping my goats off and I have to drive my trailer away because there's not space. There's no, I'm often parking my trailer somewhere and building a laneway to get my goats several hundred feet back to the area they're actually grazing. So it's not even an option. But yes, a trailer is the easiest and simplest shelter option available. I'm seeing someone says they use a pop-up tailgate tent. Man, I wouldn't. To me, that just sounds like something the goats are going to screw around with. But I can see that sort of thing would be absolutely perfect.
Yeah, I know in our area in Illinois, because we have had tents like that we use for farmers markets, and even though yes, you can buy weights to put on the legs, but our Midwestern winds.
Yep.
And just rip those things apart and flip them. And sometimes if you've got a weight on them, it just rips the leg off.
Yep.
So they're not, I mean, the farmers around here that go to farmers markets, I think they say most of them, they buy a new one about every 2 years because of the challenge. So I think we have covered all of the questions in the chat. I was marking some of them earlier as we were going through. So yeah, I think I got all the questions. Do you have any final thoughts?
Nope, just that this is, in general, we need more people doing this because I see... So within Goats on the Go, we have an affiliate directory, and if a customer goes on that directory and isn't covered by an existing affiliate, they can fill out another form that comes to me and says, hey, I'm in this area and there's no one around here, and I want to know when there becomes someone in an area. I can tell you there's demand. We need more people doing this. And most of our affiliates are as busy as they want to be. So like this job is not easy. It is not for everyone. It takes a lot of complicated skills, but it is pretty dang cool. And it is one of the better cash flowing agricultural things out there. So I encourage everyone to at least give it serious thought. And I am happy to answer questions or assist in that if people want.
Another question just popped up. How many goats did you start with?
I started with 15, and that was not enough. I was up to mid 30s, I think, by the end of my first season. And my second season, I had 2 herds of about 40 running. And then it kept growing from there. I think the max I was ever running at one time was between 250 and 300. Not all together. There was a herd of 200, and then there were a couple other herds on the side. But yeah, I started with 15, and that was not nearly enough.
Yeah. And I think, did I hear you say at one point that you had 3 separate herds in 3 different grazing spots at one time?
The most I ever did was 5 herds, and that was absolutely awful. I don't recommend that. 3 was hard, but manageable most of the time. 2 is really my happy point, being someone doing this mostly on my own with occasional help from my husband when poop hits the fan and I really need, like an emergency help. But yeah, I've had a couple hundred. Okay, someone just popped up with, do you have an algorithm of goats per acre or acres per day? That kind of was addressed a little bit earlier. I am not adjusting animal numbers by acreage unless I'm getting to those like really big jobs where it's like, all right, I'm going to break out the big herd. I'm going to get, 200, 150 to 200 goats. I'm bringing a trailer full of goats. And that's going to be it, whether it's a half an acre or 2 acres or 8 acres. I am going to be bringing my trailer full of goats, or maybe 2 trailerfuls of goats. I'm not going to cut that herd in half for an extra small project. So while I, over time, have figured out about how many days it takes for that herd to graze an acre in my region, I'm not making changes to my herd size like on the fly for different jobs.
Okay. Someone asked, what's the other insurance company you mentioned besides the Farm Bureau?
American National.
Okay. All right. And then do you go after the goats and manually remove brush that gets left?
Personally, I don't. I have a lot of friends who do or who've added that as an additional service. But that's a decision everyone should make. I've decided that the goats only are the time or what I have time and availability for. I would love to get like some of my older nephews, I'd buy a DR mower, one of those big brush hog things and pay them to go run that after the goats go through. I know there's demand for that. But that hasn't worked out for me. I know other affiliates and other companies in general who do offer the hand clearing as a follow-up, or they, the goats go through, kind of clean it up. They lop things, let the goats clean that up. And the price you can charge goes up significantly when you do that, but it's just not one I've gone after personally.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. You are going to be back tomorrow. And can you give everybody a little bit of a preview of what you're going to be talking about tomorrow?
Yeah, so it flows nicely from one into the other, okay? So you start a targeted grazing business and you're hauling your goats all over the countryside, and then you start getting calls. Oh, you have goats and you take them places. Can I rent them for a birthday party or goat yoga? Or can you, just come to a petting zoo? So after a while, I started saying, yes, I will bring goats to your birthday party or goat yoga. And so tomorrow I'll be talking about mobile things with goats, other enterprises that kind of stem off this idea of transporting or traveling around with goats. So yeah, it is called Have Goats Will Travel. And I'll go through kind of what I've done and what with the mobile livestock experiences.
I love that. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And thanks to everyone who showed up. We did record this. So we will be sending out a link in case there's anything you want to watch again or you want to share with a friend or whatever. And hope I see you guys again tomorrow. Bye, everyone.